Irish Nation, welcome back to the show. We finally have some football to talk about. Notre Dame comes out of College Station with the marquee victory of the opening weekend, 23-13. Mike, it just means more when you get to walk away and beat an SEC opponent. How you doing, sir?
I'm good. And that's actually a great segue for our fans that were in College Station because apparently, as the game was winding down, a large contingent of Notre Dame fans were chanting SEC at the Aggie fan base. So, not you don't get opportunities to do that very often. And I'm glad that our fan base took full advantage. But that was an awesome win. I think in terms of the best wins that I've experienced as a fan, I don't know exactly where I would rank that. There are a couple other games that come to mind. Certainly, Clemson in Clemson in 2020. Clemson, I guess when we blew them out a couple years ago, that was another big one. Stanford in 2012. Those are some other big ones that come to mind, but I think this one certainly stacks up against those. It certainly falls in that same short list as that. I was watching the game at the Notre Dame bar in Santa Monica, Sonny McLean's, really rowdy crowd there, a lot of fun, and actually the owner of the bar all gave us celebratory shots as the game ended. So yeah, great time. Like Brett, we were talking about this a little bit before the game, but it's so much fun, so much more fun to be able to talk about Notre Dame football when we have a big win like this. It's just we're gonna go through everything, and there are pros and cons to every game, but I think for a scenario like this, we get to focus on the pros a little bit more, and it just feels, as you said, it just means more. So if our fans are taken, if they're chanting SEC, I think we get to borrow some stuff from the SEC fan base as well.
Absolutely. Fun weekend for us. I was actually at a wedding with my wife for a St. Mary's grad from our class. So shout out Aaron on a really fun wedding weekend. This is the second year in a row now where I got to do touchdown push-ups with the bride on a wedding dance floor. So turning into a bit of a tradition. Did it last year for the Duke game. Did it here for the A&M game on the go-ahead touchdown. And shout out to my great aunt Kathy and great uncle John,
I'm here with my family,
who are some of my dearest family, as Brian Kelly would say, who gave me this Cotton Bowl T-shirt. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see the shirt I'm wearing from 1993 when Notre Dame on the left sleeve took down Texas A&M here on the right sleeve of this T-shirt. So this shirt is now about 31 years old, is well-traveled, was a gift that I got from my great aunt and uncle a while ago. So wearing it here for the show to celebrate that victory. And yeah, Mike, as you alluded, we got a good one to recap. We're going to preview the NIU game next week and then look ahead. A lot of talk in college football on game day and, the big noon kickoff show on Fox about this new 12-team format. We haven't spent a ton of time talking about it on the show, but we're going to break it down. And look, there's 11 games to go, folks. I think there's a lot of media pundits want to anoint Notre Dame into the, college football playoff already. We're not here to have that conversation. We're here to say, is it a good thing for Notre Dame? There's a lot of questions. We don't get a bye. We can't be a top 4 team, but maybe we'll get to play more home games because now the first round will be on college campuses at the higher seeds, or I guess lower seeds. So we're going to break down our thoughts on kind of statistically and looking back at some prior years, whether or not we think that's actually a good thing for Notre Dame or a bad thing without that conference championship. But first things first, Mike, let's dive into the Texas A&M game. So starting things off, Mike, let's call out some of our players and maybe position groups that we saw throughout this game really stand out. First and foremost, Ben Morrison played 62 snaps in this game, was targeted 5 times, which is pretty absurd that you play that many snaps and actually only have the ball thrown in your direction 5 times. So it's very clear that Texas A&M just said, you know what, wherever Ben Morrison is, we're throwing it the other way. And on those 5 passes, he allowed 1 catch for a measly 1 yard. I could talk about Ben Morrison forever, but I thought this was just another statement game. Noah Thomas, the kind of big breakout player, the ABC broadcast, Herb Street was even highlighting Noah Thomas, like, look for him to have a big game. Look for him to be Connor Wigman's go-to guy. Just totally shut him down, totally took away half the field for A&M. And I thought that's what really let the rest of this defense shine tonight. Started with Ben Morrison saying, guys, half the field, don't worry about it. I got you covered. You guys go focus on everything else.
Ben Morris showed up as advertised. I don't think we expected anything less. Certainly, he had some injuries in the offseason, and people were a little nervous that he might be a little banged up coming into the early part of the season. Fortunately, reports out of camp the last couple weeks show that he was pretty healthy, but a fully healthy Ben Morrison, this is the type of performance that you expect from him. And he did this last year when he was guarding Marvin Harrison. This is just what it looks like when you have a first round draft pick at corner. And Notre Dame's very blessed to be in that situation. I personally thought that the media, I thought that they were sleeping on the Notre Dame defense a bit going into this game. The only narrative you really seemed to hear was just the Notre Dame offensive line versus the Texas A&M defense. And I kept telling my friends, I have a bunch of friends who went to SEC schools or SEC fans. And Brett, I know you know a bunch of SEC fans as well living in Atlanta. But I had to remind them, I had to say, hey guys, like Notre Dame's defense is really good too. So don't sleep on that. And I think what you were talking about here is that it really does start. I mean, we're great at every level, but the secondary in particular is particularly outstanding. You mentioned Ben Morrison, but it's not even just Ben Morrison. The whole secondary was outstanding in this game. And that's what I expect for this whole year. I mean, Christian Gray, so this was his first start. I believe this was his first start. He got some playing time last year, but this was really his first big moment. He'd certainly gotten a lot of hype out of fall camp. People were saying that, they've always talked about how talented he was, but obviously a little bit inexperienced relative to some of our other players. But he really, I mean, he performed extremely well too. And I think his future is extremely promising. Gave up 3 catches for 24 yards. For someone who's making their first big start, I think that's extremely impressive. Xavier Watts, he also, another key player, defensive player of the year last year. He showed up as advertised, already got an interception. So he restarts his All-American campaign there. And then Adon Schuler, another first-time starter, another player that we've heard a lot of hype about out of camp, another one of those young, promising players. He got his first interception of his career too. So I think when you start with that and you look at the core of your secondary, and Ben Morrison sets the tone with, as you mentioned, just some elite play, but then these other key players also play at such a high level. I think that makes it really tough on the opposing offense. And then on top of that, Hurd, Clark, Mickey, these guys got some meaningful snaps as well. And they all, I mean, if you look at their Pro Football Focus grades, all these guys played well. So I think a question that we had coming into the season was, okay, we know we got some studs in the secondary, but particularly Morrison and Watts, but how are these other guys, especially some of these young guys, how are they going to step up? And I think we got an answer in this game. I think the answer is that we have maybe a little bit more depth than we were hoping. And some of these other guys who are going to be first-time starters, it seems like they're hits. It seems like these guys are going to be good players this year and potentially great players down the line.
Yeah, definitely. I thought Christian Gray, he did. I looked it up while you were talking. He started, or at least saw very meaningful reps in 3 of the final 5 games last year, especially as Cam Hart and Ben Morrison were dealing with some injuries. But certainly, coming into this game, by far the most snaps he's ever played at 48, had only ever been above 30 one other time in his career on the road. Huge game for him, and can't say enough about the secondary. I thought by far best group on the field, like best unit on either team, offense or defense, goes to Notre Dame secondary. And I think the second best group in this game was Notre Dame's defensive line. And I'd argue their linebackers were right there with them. But what we did to the A&M run game to make them incredibly one-dimensional and really, not generate a ton of pressure in this game, but didn't have to blitz either. We could go play coverage. We could go drop 7 into coverage, rush 4, and do enough to disrupt Wigman. But most importantly, just did not let them get going on the run game. I know a lot of people want to talk about the fact that Connor Wigman really struggled in this game. I get it. He was 12 for 30 for 100 yards with 2 interceptions. Not a good game on his part, but their run game was equally anemic. 34% of Texas A&M's runs went for 2 yards or less. Like, we just dominated the line of scrimmage. Like 1 in 3 runs for them just went nowhere. And we did it with a ton of different guys. This wasn't all Howard Cross, Riley Mills, and Jack Kaiser. They were great in this game, but we had 14 guys playing the front 7 for at least 17 or more snaps, which is basically saying that we had 14 guys play 3 or more drives. Jalen Snead had some huge stops. Osbury led the team, I think, with 5 tackles, had 2 run stops. Jordan Botelho, who has been known as a pass rusher throughout his career, but not disciplined against the run. That's historically been his Achilles heel. Pro Football Focus credited him with 4 run stuffs in this game to lead all players in terms of stopping the run at the line of scrimmage. So this was a deep team effort Tackling, 14% missed tackle rate. So, yeah, there's 10 missed tackles. That sounds like a lot. We often talk about that, though, on this show that, best in the country is usually around 10 to 12% over the course of a season. Obviously, when you're going up against better competition like A&M, that missed tackle rate is going to be a little bit higher. 14% is great against a team like Texas A&M. Average is about 20 to 25%. So average is probably expecting more like 15 to 20 missed tackles in a game like this. Only 10 missed tackles in an opener. First time with the pads on for these guys against a real live opponent this season. Thought overall just graded out incredibly well on both sides of the ball.
Totally. And I think, I think one thing you always hear out of fall camp is just how much rotation. You don't always hear it, but I think this is like something that you frequently hear out of fall camp is, oh, we're going to rotate a ton of players in the, the linebacker core, in the secondary, on the defensive line. And usually when you get into these key moments in big games, you don't see that as much. But we actually did see that here, Brett, as you mentioned. A lot of players, we were going pretty deep. They were getting a lot of meaningful reps. And, I think that bodes well as the season goes on. That means our players are going to be more fresh. If we have an injury or two, we should be able to withstand it. So this is it's just a testament to Al Golden, just to how well he's developed these different position groups. And like I said, this is a luxury in an individual game as the game goes on. Like I said, we're not going to get as tired, but then also as the season goes on as well. So yeah, I totally agree. I feel like this is I feel really good about where these position groups are going forward. I think the next point I want to hit, Brett, I'm going to steal your thunder here a little bit, but Mitch Jeter, Salisbury shout out, or do you want to do the
Go
shout
for
out
it.
here?
Salisbury, North Carolina, my wife's hometown. I think I'm going to mention that every single time that Mitch Jeter has a big game. Clearly a big one here in this one, but yeah, shout out Salisbury.
Yeah, well, so I think from my perspective, I think we'll see. It's just one game, but he also is a bit of a proven commodity. It's not like this is his first run around the college football scene, but looks like we have a steady leg at kicker. And there were times last year where we had a very powerful leg, but sometimes it was inconsistent, especially in late game scenarios. So 3 huge field goals, and if we hadn't gotten those, this game certainly could have gone differently. We would have been a lot more stressed. It's definitely unclear if we actually would if we would have won. But I think that's thankfully it looks like this is an area that we're not going to have to stress about too much this year. And I think that's not a luxury that every team has. There's some great Alabama teams back in the last 15 years or so under Nick Saban that they had killer offenses, killer defenses, but then the kicker would occasionally just shoot them in the foot. So it looks like we're gonna be able to avoid anything like that this year. And then Brett, you got to talk about Ben Morrison. I want to give him another shout out because that was just phenomenal. I think we just got to appreciate how lucky we are to have a player like this, just kind of like anchoring down our secondary. We can just put him on their best receiver and largely expect that receiver to have a pretty quiet game.
Absolutely. And, look, we haven't even gotten to the offense yet for any shout outs. So, we're going to dive a little deeper here into both defense and offense. But clearly the two big names we haven't said yet are Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price. Both, I thought, pretty frustrating games if you're a running back. Not a ton of room to operate, not a ton of rhythm. I think this was clearly a shaky game for our O-line. We knew that going in. We knew that it was Texas A&M strength. It was our inexperience. I thought the coaching staff did a good job trying to play call around that fact. And they both hung in there. It was very Audric Estime-like. They averaged 4.4 yards after contact. Obviously, those came on Price's big run in the fourth quarter. Third or fourth quarter in the second half. And Jeremiah Love going back-to-back. 18 and 21 yards to get into the end zone on that go-ahead score is where most of that yards after contact came from. But a ton of discipline, a ton of just stick with it mentality. And then they get the huge breakout highlight reel plays to go win the game. Really pumped for those two guys in that running back room. Feels like a two-headed monster we can lean on the rest of the way. So we'll get back into the offense a little bit more here in a second, but wanted to shout those guys out before going into this defense. So we've talked about, Mike, some of the big time players. I think it's important though to just talk about what this defense did as a unit. We've been hyping this unit as potentially all-time great. and they've matched the billing. We try not to have hot takes on the show. We try not to get ahead of our skis, but I think it's very realistic for Notre Dame fans to be thinking this could be the best team in the country on defense. This could be the best defense we've seen since 2012, since the Lou Holtz era. Like I said it in our preview, and I'm going to say it again every single episode until it happens and just reverse jinx the heck out of this. I don't think there's an offense we're going up against that can score 20 points against this team. Like, does it happen because of a pick six? Does it happen because of garbage time? I'm not going to sit here and say, like, without a doubt, they're never giving up 20 points this year. But you know what? Like, I'm going to make that bet. Like, I don't see a team on the schedule other than maybe USC that is going to be expected to score 20 points against them. And it almost felt too easy how much we were able to make A&M struggle despite the false starts, despite jumping off sides, despite kind of, struggling to settle in but still holding them to 2 field goals. And after that, it was just nothing going for A&M. And it was just, I was sitting there watching the game thinking, yep, this is what Al Golden does. This is exactly what we expected. They went out and delivered.
Totally. I think, yeah, coming into this game, coming into the season, we had both been in agreement that this is potentially, I think we said this is easily a top 5 defense, strong case for top 3. If there were a year we were ever the top defense in the country, this is certainly the year. Just if you look at everything we have coming back, this was a great defense last year, and we had so many key pieces coming back, so many players that we pegged as players with potential to make big jumps in the offseason. And I think we're already starting to see that. We called out some guys in the secondary. We called out some guys in the linebacking core. Some of these guys who are very talented that we thought could have breakout years, we're starting to see some of this already. Botello, we mentioned Botello. You said someone who was a great pass rusher, had some issues with maturity, picking up certain concepts, especially as it relates to run defense. Seems like he played pretty well this game too. So I think having watched this game, I actually maybe even feel better about that prediction than I did, say, a week ago. And now getting more into what exactly we did this game, I think certainly it's interesting to say that we might have had a little bit of a slow start on defense. And you have to keep in mind, when I say we had a slow start, that means, we gave up. For this defense, that means you give up maybe like a field goal or two. We were like a little bit jumpy. There were some offsides, some unnecessary penalties. Maybe some of that's just first game jitters in a huge road game. But by and large, we settled in after that. I think in terms of what the formula for success was here, it's something that we've seen from Al Golden before. So we weren't extremely disruptive in this game. And they had a 40% success rate, which isn't terrible. Generally, if you're an offense, you want to be mid 40s. 40% isn't bad. So it's not like we were just completely preventing them from moving the ball downfield. You mentioned there were a bunch of plays where we were able to stuff them on the run. There were also a number of plays where they were able to get some chunks as well. But I would say by and large, we didn't let them move the ball downfield so extensively that it was, allowing them to score again and again and again. And then in terms of havoc, this wasn't a particularly, this wasn't a game where we were generating a ton of havoc. We had a 12% havoc rate, which is, I would say, that's certainly below average. We only had 1 sack, not a ton of pressure on Wigman. I think similar to what we did on offense, they kind of took the same approach where they saw that we have this monster defensive line, this monster defense, and they were a little bit conservative. They didn't want to have as many long developing pass plays where they would give our defensive line an opportunity to come in and sack. And so you saw that. Now, that being said, while we didn't generate a ton of havoc, when Texas A&M made mistakes, they tended to be very big mistakes. They had two big interceptions, which we were able to capitalize on. So I guess the question is like, what really like won the game for us? Where did our defense excel? And the answer is explosiveness. We really did not allow Texas A&M to generate any big chunky plays. 0, in fact, over 20 yards. Their 2 longest plays were 15 yards and 18 yards. After that, literally the longest play was 14 yards. So
and both those were on the opening drive, by the way. After that opening drive, they didn't even get a single play rest of the game over 15 yards. It won the game.
Yeah, exactly. So that's when I was talking about a little jumpiness out the gate. We started out a little slow. And that's really what I'm talking about, is we had a couple chunky plays we gave up. There were a couple penalties, right? But we really settled in after that. And they had successful plays, but nothing that was a really like a big chunky play that allowed them to move downfield rapidly. So I think one thing that I thought was noteworthy here, and this just tells you how much Al Golden can really trust his secondary and trust his defense, is that rather than running a prevent when Texas A&M had the ball late in the game, he actually sent like some pretty aggressive blitzes and just trusted our secondary to hold up on an island. And they did. And then we got the ball back and won the game. So I think the formula, and Al Golden's someone who's going to change it up game to game, but I think in this particular game, I think that formula, maybe giving up a little bit, maybe you give up a little bit on the success rate, maybe you don't generate a ton of havoc, but just forcing them to consistently move downfield, execute 8, 10, 12 play scoring drives. I think that formula seemed to work really well here. I mean, it was really difficult for Texas A&M to stay on schedule consistently. And there were basically, if you have to sustain these long drives, at some point they made a mistake. At some point they weren't able to get as many yards as they needed to, and they would have to punt. I think one way that I think about this is if you gave me a trade and you said, we'll give you one 35-yard play or we'll give you 5 7-yard plays, which one are you going to take? I would say I'm going to take the 35-yard play every single time, because just when you have a chunky play like that, that's explosive, that tends to convert to points way more often than the alternative does here. And so I think we were willing to concede not giving up these big chunky plays and forcing them to do these like smaller successful plays over and over again. And Texas A&M largely was not able to capitalize on it. And I think it was very frustrating for them.
For sure. I mean, having to execute long scoring drives for a college football offense is difficult. Like we talk about all the time, the importance of not having 3 and outs. Like, can you just get 1 first down or just 2 first downs? Like, you don't have to go have a 10-play scoring drive. Can you just get 1 first down and flip the field? And forcing college teams to go and execute long scoring drives, they had a pretty decent success rate of staying on schedule until they had a 2nd and 10, until they had a 3rd and 10. In fact, on expected passing downs, so when it was 2nd or 3rd and long, that 40% success rate dropped to 22%. And I think this is a good example of Al Golden knowing the team he has. There's not a Jalen Smith on this team. There's not a JOK on this team. There is not someone that we think is going to go and get 15 sacks. Like Howard Cross, Riley Mills, great in the middle, but we don't have a guy that's going to go and get us 10, 15 sacks this year or go and really disrupt the backfield. And so let's not try to force that. Let's not try to, be someone we're not. Rely on our coverage, rely on our tackling, rely on holding people to 3, 4, 5-yard plays, and just make them go do it 10, 12 times, because not a lot of college football teams can do that. And I think you saw that here tonight. The question I was thinking about, is this Texas A&M offense just bad? Or can we draw conclusions here after week 1? Look, SP Plus thought that this team, the Texas A&M offense, was going to be a top 25 offense. I don't know if they're a top 25 offense. They're almost certainly a top 50 offense. Like, this is still a really talented group. Wigman is a 5-star recruit with starting experience. He had 2 horrible throws for guys that were wide open, and they both resulted in interceptions, especially that first one on the overthrow on his first interception. It was just a really, really bad throw to a wide open receiver. We slowed down, just a bad miss. But other than that, like, we held a guy to 100 yards passing who was getting talks of being like a first round draft pick in the NFL. Maybe not first overall, but like a first rounder in the NFL. And we hold them to 100 yards in the game. Like, I don't care if they're a top 20 offense or a top 50 offense. This was a dominating performance. Now, clearly, if we go and see Texas A&M go and light up the scoreboard rest of the way, yeah, that's going to make us feel better about Al Golden's unit. But I think regardless, holding this team to 13 points, holding them to only 1 touchdown drive, and just, creating a mess every single place that A&M turned, and just really not letting them have any sustained success in terms of putting points on the board. Check the box for Al Golden. Like, he proved he's one of the best in the business. He showed, he put his players in position to be super successful, and we saw great performance after great performance on the defensive side of the ball because of it, and it feels very repeatable. I thought that was the biggest thing that I walked away from in this game was, okay, this defense not only picked up where they left off next year, they're better. And they are, like, you look at it, good in the secondary, good at linebacker, good on the defensive of the line, and depth. Like, that was kind of the one question of like, oh, like, who's going to be the 5th, 6th guy off the defensive line? What's going to happen if Ben Morrison goes down or Xavier Watts goes down? I feel great about the two deep across the board and walking away just feeling like I think we got the best defense in the country, and that's going to play real well come playoff time.
Yeah, and defense tends to travel, I would say, more so than offense. So I think that just gives you a base level of certainty going into a lot of games. So yeah, like very pleased with the performance. Actually, I think one note I want to amend is I think I had made a comment that like I think Golden was like giving a little bit on the success rate. I think that's actually probably not a fair characterization. I think it was more, as I mentioned earlier, Texas A&M was just calling a conservative game plan, and that was just our reaction to it. So it just doesn't give us an opportunity to create a lot of havoc. And I think one thing that'll be interesting for me to note moving forward is when teams are being a little more aggressive and they're not just focusing on these shorter plays, are we able to generate havoc? And I think we will be able to. It seems like we have all the ingredients to be able to do so, depending on the game.
Absolutely. So moving over to the defensive side of the ball, I think there's a narrative out there that ND struggled offensively in this game, and we want to set the record straight. That is not our perspective. Las Vegas expected this game to be 25-22. So they expected Notre Dame, the experts, the numbers people, the nerds out there, expected Notre Dame to score 22 points, and we scored 23. So I'm not sitting here saying this was an offensive juggernaut and we've got a Heisman Trophy winner at quarterback and we're about to go score 40 points a game. But we did our job. Mike Denbrock did our job. And we talked about this. This was the perfect example of what we were excited about in Mike Denbrock, that it doesn't matter if it's a good defense or a bad defense. He figures out a way to put together strong performances. Not out of this world, not greatest game ever. But last year, what we saw with Jared Parker was that Notre Dame would absolutely wipe the floor when we went against a USC defense or a Navy defense or a Pittsburgh defense who was struggling. Great, we'd go put up 50 points. But when we went up against the top defenses in Ohio State or Clemson or Louisville, of course we were going to score less, but we way underperformed versus expectation. So sure, expectation, score 35, 40 points against USC, great if you score 50. But when the expectation is that you still got to go score in the 20s, you still got to go get 23, 28, 24 points against those top defenses, can you at least show up and do that? Parker couldn't. And credit Denbrock, it was frustrating. It was a slog. We had a very inexperienced offensive line. That was a very well covered narrative, but it didn't matter. Denbrock figured out a way. We took a lot of the playbook out of this one. A perfect example is that Riley Leonard's average time to throw was 2.1 seconds. By comparison, average is about 3. So his average depth of throw was just over 5 yards in this game. Like we just said, look, we're not going to ask our offensive line to try to hold up in pass protection. We didn't have a single ball thrown over 20 yards downfield. We didn't take one deep shot. We just said we're going to stick to the game plan, short, quick passing throws, try to get guys in space, try to wear them down and stick to the run, have a really balanced play calling between running the ball and passing the ball, and just stick with it. And then he found wrinkles. He found wrinkles throughout that game. He found the inside zone was working really well. He found a number of looks for Riley Leonard. I thought it was super successful when we'd have one or two running backs motion them out wide and have no running back standing next to Riley Leonard, and then have Leonard be the runner. Like have the defense shift into thinking, oh, we need to be in coverage. There's no running back in the backfield. They're going to be passing the ball, and then use Riley Leonard's legs. And it was picking up 6, 7, 8, 9 yards. Those were the moments that won the game. I know we all want to talk about Jadarian Price's long touchdown run and Jeremiah's long touchdown run, but it was doing enough to keep us on schedule in a really challenging game against a really great defense. It wasn't amazing, but this was a very solid output that, paired with an Al Golden defense, it worked. And if this is the floor where we go from here, got to feel really excited about what's coming in the next 11 games.
I think we saw in that late 8-play, 85-yard touchdown drive, I think that's where you saw why Mike Denbrock was such a critical hire. So I'm just going to go through this real quick. But first first play of the drive, not like you mentioned how important Riley Leonard's legs are. 9-yard run, 9-yard run really helps set the tone for this drive. We had a loss with Jeremiah Love right after, but then shortly after that, then it's just like successful play after successful play, some big chunky plays. We had a 9-yard Jaden Greathouse pass. We had that 20-yard Bo Collins throw, and then Riley Leonard for another 11-yard run. Jeremiah Love for 18 yards, another 1-yard run after that, and then we had the 20-yard run with Jeremiah Love after that where he scored a touchdown. So there really was, if you look at that, there was really only one. I guess there were two plays in that drive that were not successful. The rest tended to be really successful. Clearly had Texas A&M on their heels. It was a good great balance here. It was a great combination of Riley Leonard runs, chunky throws, and then just running the ball down their throat. So whereas last year, I felt like in these scenarios late in the game where the offense needed to just do something. The defense, it's like, come on, like the defense has done everything they possibly could in this game. Can the offense at least give us like one big touchdown drive here? And by and large, last year that didn't happen. The moment seemed too big for him. We'd falter. We would not be able to come up in those moments. In this game against a really good Texas A&M defense, Denbrock was at his finest when the lights were the brightest. And of course, the players were here too. Leonard, Bo Collins, Jeremiah Love, all these guys came up big in this. So I think, again, you're talking about how it was a slog, but Denbrock technically he technically hit the point total he was supposed to and did enough for us to win. I think he like really showed how important he is just in this one drive. But I think, I'm excited to see, what else he can do as we get further into the season, as the offense, continues to develop more. And I think that's a good segue for one of the first themes we want to focus on here from the game. And that's the offensive line, one of the biggest areas for development, one of the biggest question marks coming into this game. And I think for me, I know everyone was really worried about how they were going to perform. I think that they did fine. So it was a bit shaky, but it was okay. They certainly performed well enough for us to win the game, which we did. I think people were nervous that this could have been the one thing that was going to sink the entire ship on offense, and it wasn't. But I don't want to. Let's be clear. Like, it was not a good performance, right? We only gave up one sack, but that was generally because we were, as you mentioned, Brett, we were just getting rid of the ball really quickly. We weren't allowing our offensive line to, we weren't like allowing them to get taken advantage of by the Texas A&M defensive line, which I think is, again, that speaks to Mike Denbrock, that he's calling plays that are making sure that our offensive line isn't completely exposed. But I think the one area where we certainly did not stack up as well for the offensive line was the run blocking. So by and large, our run blocking was poor. There was that one exception at the end of the game where we executed a run block perfectly for a Jeremiah Love touchdown. But other than that, there were a lot of runs that got blown up. And most of the yards that we got tended to just be Love and Price just creating something out of nothing. So I think certainly this is an area that moving forward we should hopefully improve in quite a bit, because this is a very young, very inexperienced offensive line. But the offensive line didn't play great. They just didn't play poorly enough to lose. So there's a couple ways of looking at this. One is, this is an area for tremendous upside as the year goes on, but it might take a little bit to get there. So, I mean, I'll just give one stat right here. I mentioned the run blocking. The push we were getting was only 1.5 yards before contact. You're really not giving your running backs a whole lot there. So hopefully, I would like to say hopefully by the end of the year, when we talk about the stat moving forward, hopefully we're getting closer to like a 2.5 or 3. Because I think when you get there, you're giving your running backs, who are clearly extremely talented, more room to generate big chunky plays.
And 5 penalties by the offensive line alone. I know penalties was a frustrating part of this game. What I'll say on that is a lot of pre-snap penalties that I think can be cleaned up the most, especially the defensive false starts. Clearly, there was something Aaron Rodgers like that A&M was doing pre-snap that was getting our defense out of sync. Kept happening. Very frustrating as a fan. But I'm always watching, are you taking penalties because it's a holding and like it just saved you from getting beat, or defensive pass interference because you're just getting beat and it was saving a wide open touchdown? So I always look of like, are they penalties because you're getting beat and you're out of position, or are they penalties because it was pre-snap motion and you just had a dumb mistake that's game one and you can clean up? Felt like most of that, but the offensive line was a little bit of both. And And, the success rate for our offense as a whole was only 30%. Again, you want to be in the high 40s. You want to be kind of close to every other player staying on schedule. Here was less than 1 in 3. So not good. I think a lot of those, we had a lot of 1st and 15s. We had a lot of 2nd and 20. We had a lot of 3rd and long because we had a 2nd and 15. And so I thought the penalties got us behind the chains on a number of drives. And when that happened, I thought Denbrock did a great job of not forcing it, not trying to make up for everything in one big play, and just stick with the script, flip the field, rely on our defense, next shot, next drive, next play. And I thought that went really well. We talked about the running backs. Price breaks into the house for 47 yards. Love broke off gains of 18 and then the 21-yard score. Thought both of those were great, patient drives, patient runs, reading the inside zone. The other big thing that stood out to me in this game that I'll credit the transfer portal, I'll credit Mike Denbrock's play calling. I think 9 different guys had a catch. And we talked a lot in the offseason about being surprised the media was just kind of anointing the wide receiver room as fixed or as a big upgrade from last year without really a bona fide number one. I thought Bo Collins showed flashes with 5 catches, 62 yards, the huge 20-yard back shoulder fade, 50-50 ball he came down with to convert a big 3rd down play on a go-ahead scoring drive. That play was a huge momentum swing in this game. And so I'm not sitting here saying the wide receivers won the game or were dominant by any stretch. It was a pretty quiet performance overall in the passing game. I think part of that was play calling to protect our offensive line. But I do think, we talked about, are we going to have 6 number 2 wide receivers? Yeah, I think so. We had a lot of guys show flashes. We had a lot of guys kind of step up and have a moment or block well or be involved in the game. I am mindful, Jordan Faison.
You're 5 feet nothing, 100 and nothing.
Our smallest wide receiver out there did go down with a bum ankle, but it sounds like it's just a sprain and he'll be back. Maybe not next week, but shouldn't miss meaningful time. So overall, I think this is the biggest area for us to learn more. I think this is the biggest area that we're still not putting as much focus on of, does Riley Leonard actually have guys getting the ball? Like, Riley Leonard didn't have a great game, and it's not because guys were wide open and Riley Leonard was missing them. Riley Leonard didn't have a good game throwing the ball because no one was open. And that's not just conservative play calling. But this is probably the best defense we're going to play all year. This is probably the most hostile environment we're going to see all year. So if this is the starting point from here, we should be really optimistic of where this passing game can go, but acknowledge right now it's got a long ways to go. But Bo Collins showed us a lot. The other guys showed flashes. And I think we checked the box enough in this first game, but I think it's still the place where I'm not sure the media is focused on it enough. I'm not sure the broadcast got it or Pete Sampson at the Athletic. Like, this is still a room without an All-American for sure. But did enough in College Station.
Yeah, I think the passing game for me is still very much a question mark, and there's reasons to be optimistic. Mitchell Evans, he only played 10 snaps. I think people were hoping he'd be a little healthier in this game because he potentially is a very critical weapon for us if he's fully healthy. So,
and just like a reminder, 10 months removed from an ACL injury, so like not at all surprised that he's not back game 1 ready to go play. But yeah, he was clearly not at full strength yet.
Definitely. And I think on 3rd downs in particular, and this is an area where we've really struggled this game. So there are a lot of reasons we struggled on 3rd down this game. One was, you mentioned the penalties. We were in a lot of tricky scenarios just because we kept shooting ourselves in the foot. But not having a Mitchell Evans, who is someone who would be a really key weapon in those 3rd down situations, that also hurts. And while our tight ends, I think they played okay, our tight ends behind them, they certainly didn't play at the level that someone Mitchell Evans would. So I think hopefully we get him back full strength at some time in the next couple of weeks, and I think that could add to our offense. But yeah, I mean, I think for Riley, for Riley Leonard, I think it's like you mentioned, Brett, it's a little hard to evaluate him. It was a really tough defense. We played a very conservative game plan. Sure, he had a couple misreads, but I think for me, the big takeaway is that I liked what I saw mentally from him. He was someone who definitely did not flinch, and something that we consistently heard in the offseason, or even from members of the Duke media, right? They would always say, well, this is a guy who just kind of, he just kind of like, he's a gamer. He just like shows up in the big moments and he makes big plays. And that is definitely what we saw in this game. I think I mentioned that one scoring drive that we had that really helped seal the game, where Denbrock called he called really good play after really good play. A big part of that was Riley Leonard was at his best on that final drive too. He hit some big throws. He had some nice runs there. So I think for me, it seemed like he was getting better as the game went on. And I don't want to overreact to that, but I think certainly you'd much rather see your offense, your passing game improve over the course of a game and seem to figure out a defense. Doesn't mean that our passing game is going to improve dramatically over the course of the year, but I think it does give some cause for hope, certainly as we get further into the season.
Absolutely. And look, we've been talking about this game now for 40 minutes here, and I don't think we've mentioned Marcus Freeman yet. What a great moment for him. There's some footage that went at least a little bit viral, at least in the world of Notre Dame football, of him getting the team hyped up in the tunnel, kind of getting involved with our fans on our end of the field. This was not a 100% like locked in game. We were underdogs for a reason. And I think there's a narrative out there of Notre Dame not winning big games on the road. Guess what? It's hard to win on the road against top 20 teams, top 25 teams. That's really stinking hard. Like, think about how many teams have come into Notre Dame Stadium and beat us when we were having a good ranked season. Like, it doesn't happen very often. And the reverse is true. Other than, I don't know, Alabama and Georgia, has anyone consistently gone on the road and won big games in any conference, in any scenario? It is the hardest thing to do in this sport. And so the goal is not to win every time you go have a ranked game. I think the goal is to go show up and go be competitive and put yourself in a position to win and then win your fair share. And I think that's the biggest difference right now that we're seeing between Marcus Freeman and Brian Kelly. We talked in the offseason, we're actually not seeing Freeman go and be a better recruiter. Recruiting's about the same. And what we are seeing, though, is big game coach, big game adjustments, big game tactician, big game clock management, big game decision-making on, over the years, we were kind of like, man, are we going to get a conservative defensive coach who doesn't go for it on 4th and short? Hell yeah, we do. He talked in the press conference, we're going to be aggressive to go win football games. Like, he's using analytics, but he's getting the guys hyped. He's showing the real Marcus Freeman. Like, I think we are now seeing him comfortable in his own skin in year 3. And I feel awesome for him. Like, we were so competitive at Ohio State. We were pretty darn competitive against Clemson last year. I know we lost, but we lost by 8 in a really hostile, tough place to play. We were competitive against Louisville, but you got to win your fair share. And so I think this is a big one for him. Sure, he's now 1-3 on the road against ranked teams here in the last 2 years. I view that as okay. I view that as actually pretty good. I think if he were 0-4, we'd have a huge narrative about this that we wouldn't really be able to shake the rest of the year. We don't have another big road game. I guess maybe USC at the end of the year. Do I wish we were 2-2 in those games? Do I wish we were 3-1 in those games? Sure, of course I do, because we're all Notre Dame fans. But realistic expectations is be competitive in every single one of those games. Like, I get it. He's got 3 losses now in the last 2 years on the road against ranked teams, and this was his first win. But he also hasn't lost by double digits. That's pretty stinking impressive for a young coach who's up and coming. And so I'm pumped for him to go get this big road victory. There's people saying this is our biggest road win since Oklahoma in 2012. I don't know. That might be a little bit of a stretch, but it's a big one. It's a really, really big win for the narrative, if nothing else. It's a huge data point now for college football playoff rankings, which we'll get to a little bit at the end of the show. But I think for Marcus Freeman to get a signature win of sorts, we still don't know, a ton about Texas A&M rest of the way, but certainly week 1, prime time, I think biggest game of the weekend other than maybe USC LSU, but I think this was a bigger game than that. Huge moment for Freeman and his career.
Totally. So I think we've covered Texas A&M ad nauseum. I think we could honestly, it feels great talking about games like this. I could easily go another hour, but I think it's time for us to start to move the clock forward, and we can talk about our opponent for next week, and that's NIU. So we're gonna keep this preview short. It's really the takeaways. It's fairly simple here. Is we're pretty overwhelming favorites. So early lines from Vegas have us as 30-point favorites, which I don't know exactly how that stacks up from a probability standpoint, but I would guess it probably means we're like 99.5% favorites or
Yeah,
something like that
ESPN's
in this
got us
game.
at about 96, 97%.
Okay, so maybe not 99.9%. Maybe I was getting a little ahead of my skis there, but odds are if we
Favorites.
basically what it says is if we show up and we don't have some crazy slew of injuries, we should win this game. So and then SP Plus, we got to wait for them to update, but that actually they're a little bit more favorable to Notre Dame. It says we're more like 35 point favorites on a neutral field, which would mean 37-38 at home. So one note here on the coach, Thomas Hammock. It's his alma mater. And he was previously a position coach in the NFL. So you have someone here who's coached at the highest level. And I think for a MAC program, he's done a solid job. I mean, look, they were 7-6 last year, which was, I think, surprising to a lot of people. And they won 6 of their last 8. So clearly this is a team that's been on a positive trajectory. Key player to call out here, Ontario Brown. Actually, when Brett initially typed up these notes, he typed in Antonio Brown. So I had to text the group. I was like, they have a guy named Antonio Brown. And then Brett quickly.
I was just trying to bait you into, having to take.
Oh,
I'll
have another one.
I feel like if we said Antonio, if we called someone Antonio Brown and they were not Antonio Brown, that might be worth
that would be a Malort shot. Yeah, that
for sure.
So I was just trying to bait you into the mistake, but you caught it. So
I caught it. Yeah, got some eagle eyes here. So not Antonio Brown, Ontario Brown. He is one of the best backs in the MAC. He had over 1,300 yards last season. Pretty compact guy. He's like 5'10", 220. So certainly someone who kind of moves a bit like a bowling ball. First team All MAC. So I think in terms of offensive talent, this is the guy to really focus on. In terms of the quarterback position, Rocky Lombardi, which is a great name, by the way. That was their quarterback last year. Previously a Michigan State QB who eventually made his way to Northern Illinois. Now the current starter this year's Ethan Hampton. We don't really have a whole lot on him at this point. He did throw for 5 touchdowns in their opener, but it was against an FCS opponent. So not a ton of data that you can really glean from that. They do have a lot of returning production, and I think that's a general theme for this team. So 5 of their top 7 wide receivers are back from last year. And in that game, Hampton threw touchdowns to 5 different players. So it seems like he was pretty effective at distributing it. Again, it's against an FCS opponent, so you don't want to take away too much from it. But I think big picture, this is it's an okay MAC offense. So in terms of the grand scheme of college football, that means it's actually a really bad offense. In terms of SP Plus, sorry, maybe I'm being a little too negative here. Well, actually, I'm about to say what their SP Plus ranking is.
The MAC is bad. Yeah, we can say that.
Yeah, I think it's like, as I was like going through them, I was like, maybe I'm making them sound a little bit better than they actually are, but let's level set here. So solid MAC offense, but in terms of SP Plus, right now it has them as 123rd out of 134 FBS programs. So it should be one of the worst offenses in the entire country. And it's probably the worst offense that we'll face all year.
Yeah. Going over the defensive side of the ball, definitely their strength. 57th in SP Plus, again, out of 134 teams. So kind of a middle of the pack defense. They allowed just 21 points per game a year ago. So, fundamentally sound team. A little bit like Notre Dame. They didn't generate a lot of havoc last year, just 23 sacks, but also a ton of experience coming back. They have 8 returning starters, and their best player on defense is cornerback Javon Bird, who is second team All MAC a year ago. So a very similar formula that, say, Al Golden follows. Lean on a really strong secondary, bring back a ton of experience and a ton of starters, and might not generate a ton of havoc, but overall limit points, force long drives. And so I think that's the strength of the team. I think it's the one way, like if this game stays close, it's because they have a pretty good defense. And I think if they can rely on their secondary to just play one-on-one and not provide a ton of help, not need to provide a bunch of 2 safety looks, not need to give their cornerbacks, a ton of support, kind of like we do with Ben Morrison, and then load up on the run. I think that's where they could keep this game close. There's a reason why we're 30-point favorites. I'm not expecting it, but I do think that's the formula. And Mike, as you mentioned, experience is the theme. They have 15 returning starters. I thought more impressively, they have 33 returning seniors overall on this team. So a very experienced team, one that was pretty good, made a bowl game last year, bring a lot back. And in a game right now where everything's a revolving door with transfers and NIL deals and, folks going early to the draft, that's where I think NIU is really a sign of stability. That if they keep this game close, it's because of that. It's because they're an experienced, savvy team that shows up with a good game plan that can rely on their defense, muck things up. I think that would be their path forward. Why this game is not close? Talent. They are 124th in the 24/7 talent composite with a whopping 0 4 or 5-star recruits on their roster. By contrast, Notre Dame is 10th in that metric, in that category, and we have 57 4-stars. So Notre Dame is going to be running out there with 4-stars at substantially every position, and NIU has none. And so I think a really good team. I think one that could contend in the MAC this year, one we should take seriously. But the efficiency metrics don't lie. Like, they're 124th on offense. They have an inexperienced quarterback. Really, his first game against an FBS opponent at Notre Dame Stadium. It's just hard seeing them keep up with Notre Dame in this game, or certainly scoring enough points to be there at the end. So, Mike, let's get into predictions. Notre Dame is a 30-point favorite. Spread is, the over-under is 46.5. So that implies about a 38-8 score. What's your prediction in this one?
I'm a little bit more optimistic, not dramatically different, but I have us winning 40-6. I just, as we both talked about, I think NIU will just be completely outclassed this game. The one thing that I think is interesting is that their defense is okay, right? I think in terms of all of FBS, it's above average. But in terms of the defenses that we will face this year, it's an okay defense. And I think because that defense is competent, I think that's probably a fair word to use here. I think it's possible that they could get a short field once or twice here and maybe be able to get a field goal from it. But one thing that I'll be looking at is, because this defense is competent enough, I think that we can actually get some decent data for the passing game here. I think their secondary in particular, that's like one of the strengths of the team. So if we want to see our passing game evolve, if we want to see if Riley Leonard can improve this week, if we want to get a better read on our receivers, if we want to actually take some shots downfield, I think this actually, if we're able to do that effectively, I think this is actually, and if we do it effectively, that could actually be a good sign moving forward. Because again, this is a team that's actually okay at defending against that.
So I just updated my prediction, because if I'm going to predict that Notre Dame is going to have the best defense in the country, I got to put my money where my mouth is. So I originally wrote down 42-7 with a garbage time score preventing the shutout. I'm updating that, and I'm officially logging a prediction of 42-0. Notre Dame's first of many shutouts in this 2024 campaign. So we both have Notre Dame winning big. We both think this is a really big matchup. But I do want to be clear, like, we've lost to Marshall, we've lost to Stanford. Like, I get those were, year one, Marcus Freeman, different team, different quarterback situation, first year Al Golden, like a lot of reasons to just believe those types of performances are gone. But when you're playing a team, as we keep saying, with 15 returning starters, football is a weird sport, but I think we're both very bullish on this one, having Notre Dame winning a blowout. And I'm going to put the, big one on this one and say Notre Dame 42-0. So with that, let's move to our third segment here on today's show. The college football playoff format has expanded from 4 teams to 12. You'd probably have to be living under a rock as a football fan to have not heard that narrative at some point. Everywhere you look, people talk about 2 things: transfers and the new 12-team playoff. And the 12-team playoff has a lot of wrinkles to it. This isn't just the top 12 teams, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down to 12, get in. There's some real wrinkles to it. We want to break that down specifically from a Notre Dame lens for Irish Nation out there to understand, what does this mean for Notre Dame? So, Mike, I'm going to start with kind of an overview of the format, and then would love for you to kind of go through some of the notes we've been discussing about what it means for Notre Dame's path, whether it's a good thing for Notre Dame or a bad thing. And then at the end, I've done some research on different scenarios. If you said, hey, what happened in 2021 or what happened in 2018? So different times when Notre Dame was in that conversation, how would have it shook out for Notre Dame overall to get in. So starting with the format, um, the 5 highest ranked conference champions automatically get in. And then the next 7 highest ranked teams get in as an at-large. So what that means is if the 5th highest ranked conference champion is the 18th team in the country, say it's Liberty, which it was last year. Liberty would have been that team ranked number 23. Liberty would move up and be the 12th seed. So 5 highest ranked conference champions, and then the next 7 at-large teams. And so what that means is if you were the number 12 team last year, you actually wouldn't have gotten in. Liberty would have gotten in, and you would have been missing out and would have actually been the 13th team in terms of seeding. Importantly, there's only 4 power conferences now: ACC, Big 10, SEC, Big 12. There's still the Pac-2. So if Washington State or Oregon State are up there, they're effectively like a group of 5 team. But what that 5th conference champion means is, and a group of 5 team is guaranteed to at least get one group of 5 team in as an auto bid. And then importantly, there's 4 buys. So the top 4 teams don't play in the first round, and you have to be a conference champion. So the 4 highest ranked conference champions get a bye. So what that means is Notre Dame can never get a bye. Disadvantage number 1, Notre Dame can never get a bye. Teams 5 through 8 will not only be the proverbial lower seed, but it will actually be played on college campus stadium. So if Notre Dame is ranked effectively 1 through 8, we will then be 5 through 8 because we can't be 1 through 4, but would get to play a home game in South Bend in December in the inclement weather. I already can't wait to start hearing the conversations if Notre Dame is going to someday build an indoor stadium, but that's for another day. And so, Mike, walk us through what that means in terms of Notre Dame's path, not being able to get that bye, not playing in a conference championship game. Do we think that's better or worse for Notre Dame's path?
We've debated this back and forth, and I think, frankly, if you were to do, I'm going to sound like a nerd here, but probability trees of winning a championship, I think it's probably pretty close in terms of which one is a better path. I think where we've landed is that we think it's a better path, not dramatically so, but a little bit better. So I think I'll talk about, I guess I'll go into this a little bit more, but if Notre Dame, if we're a top 5 team going into conference championships, the big thing here is that we don't have to risk playing a conference championship, potentially lose that game. Like hypothetically, we got blown out, then we could potentially, we might not even necessarily have a home game if we lose in that scenario. We might slide to like 10 or 11, and then we have to play a good team, and we're going to be tired because guess what? We just played in a conference championship. So I think that's the scenario that kind of works, that basically that we don't have to deal with, that's favorable for us. So I think the simplest way of putting this is that essentially not playing in a conference championship is our bye. And I think most people are okay with that as a trade. It doesn't seem overly fair or unfair either way. And then if we're 6 through 12 and we get in, we weren't going to get a top 4 spot anyway, but we still, as I mentioned, we're essentially getting the equivalent of a bye. And then if you're on the cusp, say 9 through 12, in that scenario, you do have to play in a conference championship game and lose. You would have risked missing out altogether anyway.
Yeah, and I think the risk of playing in that conference championship game and then needing to win to get a bye and lose, you either A, don't get a bye, or worse, you were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 and fall out of the rankings. That's kind of a way worse risk than at least say, you know what, I don't have to play that game. I don't have to take on another data point, but also risk of injuries and everything else. Now, the downside that we haven't talked about and probably won't spend too much time on is, well, yeah, but if you were the 13th or 14th seed and you played in a conference championship game and then played your way into the tournament, sure. But let's be clear, if you're the 14th team in the country to get through this college football playoff with, now having to go win 2-3 games, that's a pretty tough path anyways. Like those, you're not actually contending. Like if you're the 14th team in the country, even if you win your conference championship, you're probably not actually contending. So I'm most focused on well, when is Notre Dame a top 4, top 6, maybe top 8 team and actually in the conversation of contending for a national championship? We've argued on this show before that there's a lot of times the 3rd or 4th team in the country isn't really contending either, and it's really a 2-team race or a 3-team race in any given year. And so I'm going to go into a couple scenarios. I'll try to keep them quick. The first one that I think is one of the more interesting scenarios is 2021. Notre Dame was number 6 going into conference championship weekend, and Oklahoma State was number 5. They lost to Baylor in the Big 12 championship game, so Notre Dame moved up to number 5. Now, in this scenario, we actually still wouldn't have even been number 5 because the top 4 teams were Alabama, Michigan, Georgia, and Cincy. Well, there were 2 SEC teams in Alabama and Georgia. Alabama beat Georgia in the SEC championship game. So the top 4 teams need to be a conference champion. So in that scenario, Baylor would have actually moved up as the Big 12 conference championship and leapfrogged both Georgia and Notre Dame. So in this scenario, it would have been Alabama, Michigan, Cincy, and Baylor are 1 through 4. Georgia goes to number 5. Notre Dame goes to number 6. I'll come back to Notre Dame in a second. Examples of what happened to other teams. Oregon was number 10 and lost in the Pac-12 championship. Almost said Big Ten, current conference, previously of the Pac-12. Lost to Utah, now a member of the Big 12. That's also so confusing. Independent, so much better. It's just less confusing. So Oregon loses in the Pac-12 championship game and fell out of the tournament. They would have moved from number 10 to number 14. Utah jumped up from number 17 to number 11. So Utah plays their way in. Oregon plays their way out. But realistically, like, Utah was the number 17 team. Like, they weren't going in anyway. Like, they weren't going to go contend anyway. So I get there's a blessing and a curse of that conference championship game to be able to play your way into the tournament. But Utah didn't play their way into a bye. Utah wasn't a top 4 team. Like, they weren't actually going to go contend in that playoff format. And so there, Notre Dame as the 6th seed would have gotten a home game against Utah. And if we won that, we would have drawn Cincy in a neutral site game, number 6 versus number 3 in the second round. Playing that backwards, that's a really favorable path for Notre Dame to not have to play in a conference championship game and not have to play Alabama, Michigan, Georgia, or Ohio State, really the top teams that year. Notre Dame would have avoided till the semis. And I all think this is about what's the easiest path to get to the semis. Because once you're in the semis, you got to go you got to go win 2 games against top 5 teams, if not top 2 teams. And I think that's a pretty favorable path for Notre Dame to try to get to one of those, final 4 teams, if you will, or final 2 teams, if you will. Pretty easy path. 2020, COVID rankings were weird. The Pac-12 only played 6 games. Like, I know we got into the, college football playoff that year, interestingly, by playing in the ACC and still losing in that championship game to Clemson. But just kind of weird scenarios there. So skipping that one. The other one I wanted to highlight was 2018. I think this is the best scenario to kind of show why we think this is slightly favorable. Notre Dame is undefeated. So we were number 3 before conference championships, number 3 after. Alabama and Clemson had locked up the top 2 spots. Oklahoma was number 4 and Ohio State was number 6 as the next conference champions. So they would have jumped us. And therefore, we would have moved to number 5. This year also saw UCF as undefeated number 8. So that G5 spot wasn't number 12. We would have gotten 3-loss Penn State. So if we would have beaten number 12 Penn State at home, we would have drawn the 4 seed Ohio State. So still avoid the top 2 teams until the semis, but that's a pretty tough draw. Like, the other teams in those at-large games would have been Georgia, Michigan, UCF, Washington, Florida, and LSU. Penn State and Ohio State is, the 2 teams you got to go beat. I don't know if it's that different being the 4 seed and playing in a conference championship game or being the 5 seed and having to play Penn State and Ohio State. And so, sure, we don't get a bye. We avoid the conference championship. Mike, to what you said earlier, it's kind of splitting hairs. I think the thing we haven't talked about the most is how often would it be that G5 school? So in this scenario, I said we would have had to have played Penn Penn State because the G5 team, UCF, in this scenario, was already better than the 12 spot. Or in our earlier scenario, Cincy was actually in the top 4. So like the group of 5 was not actually the 12 team, would have not actually been the 12 seed. That's very much the exception to the rule. So 3 times in the last decade, the highest ranked G5 school was in the top 10. Number 8, and number 4. We mentioned 2 of them. All of the other times, they were like number 15 to number 23. It's kind of the range of outcomes. As an example, last year was number 23 Liberty. And so also something important to note, not every time, but most of the time, if Notre Dame's a top 4 team and we fall back to number 5, we're getting a group of 5 team. And that's going to be the most favorable matchup every time because it's someone who's really not a top 12 team. They're just getting pulled up into the top 12 because they're that 5th conference champion.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, I mean, I think a big conclusion here is that I think access to the playoff, access to the championship, that I think for Notre Dame's independent status, that is always one of the pillars of that status. And if you're looking at this current structure, if we're 10-2, we're basically going to be getting into this playoff pretty much like the vast majority of the time. I mean, there could be a scenario where we don't, some weird year where we don't, but it's hard to imagine too many scenarios where we don't get in. And then if we're undefeated and our number 5, Brett, as you said, we get that G5 at home. It could be like a Liberty, and then we get the most favorable matchup against, it would be the weakest team that got a bye. So that could also be a team that's seated much higher than they would have otherwise. So I think that could be a very favorable path to potentially getting into that Final Four. And then that's obviously when things get interesting because that's when you're going to be most likely to actually face a truly elite team. So I think, again, like you said, Brett, we're splitting hairs here, but I think this path actually works for us pretty well. And then we went through some scenarios where we avoid these conference championship scenarios where we're actually seated in a pretty good spot going into that conference championship weekend. But then if we played a conference championship, we risk either losing our home field advantage or we risk just falling out of the playoff altogether. So again, I think it's just there are different ways. There are different pros and cons to being in a conference and not being a conference as it relates to the structure. I think we tend to lean towards this being a little bit better for us, but at the end of the day, it doesn't make a massive difference, which I guess is, they always say like a great compromise here kind of has pretty good pros and cons either way. And I think that's exactly the case here. No one on either side is, I would say, very upset about how this affects Notre Dame. I think if we were getting an unfair advantage, we would certainly be hearing about that quite a bit from opposing fan bases. And if it was a huge disadvantage against us, the Notre Dame fans we would be talking about it to no end.
For sure. I've definitely heard some people say, oh, it's not fair. Notre Dame doesn't have to play in a conference championship. And I've also heard people say, haha, you can't have a bye.
They say both. They'll say both.
They say both. And it's kind of like, look, that's a trade-off. And I think this is largely much to do about nothing, but slightly better. That's a good trade. Like that's a good negotiation. Jack Swarbrick had a seat at the table. We signed off on this format. And I would put this into the bucket of the 12-team format is not a reason for Notre Dame to stay independent. It's also not a reason for us to join a conference. Like it's generally neutral, slightly favorable. We just got to go win football games. We just got to go compete and play and win. If anything, I think who you don't want to be is like the 4th or 5th best team in the SEC or the 4th or 5th best team in the Big Ten that just has a brutal schedule now. And, maybe sneaks their way into in fact, actually, you maybe don't want to be the 2nd best team in those conferences. It might actually be better to be 3rd or 4th, be ranked 10 and just get in, but not have to play in a conference championship game. So I think there's going to be all sorts of controversy over the college football playoff format because of these quirks and nuances and how do you decide and everything else. But I think if Notre Dame goes and takes care of business and is, truly a contender as a top 5 team as we think we are this year, ND will be just fine in this format. And good for us to all know about it. Good for us to know the details. But I think a pretty neutral thing that isn't going to, break or isn't going to win us a championship and is not going to lose us a championship. I think overall it's pretty neutral. So with that, Notre Dame 1-0, the home opener next week. Until we see y'all again next week, Irish beat Huskies.
Irish beat Huskies.